My parents told everyone I died, held a memorial, and raised thousands in my name. They used my death to renovate their house. 5 years later, I showed up to their church fundraiser and took the mic. "You've always been the problem." Those words echo in my head more often than I'd like to admit, sometimes in the voice of my father, sometimes my mother, sometimes in my own. I've come to realize that when you grow up in a house where love is conditional, your inner voice doesn't sound like you. It sounds like the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally but didn't. I was 28 when I found peace, but I was maybe 8 when I first realized I was different. Not in the cool, quirky, after-school special kind of way. Different in the way that gets noticed by a hyper-religious family that measures worth by how well you obey, not who you are. I'm the oldest of 4. Born and raised in a suburban Midwestern town that still runs on gossip, church bulletins, and casseroles. Picture a cul-de-sac with every house manicured like it's competing for some neighborhood trophy. My parents, George and Linda, loved appearances. They worshipped order, discipline, and the Bible in that order. Our family photo could have been a stock image for American values. White picket fence, matching Easter outfits, polite smiles for the camera. But if you peeled back the curtains, you'd see a different kind of household, one where control wore the mask of love and obedience was confused with respect. Growing up, I never quite fit. While my siblings, Ben, Katie, and little Luke, could parrot back Bible verses or rehearse grace before dinner like trained actors, I was the one asking questions. Why do we have to go to church 4 times a week? Why can't I just listen to music like everyone else at school? Why does Dad yell at me and not them? That was strike 1, curiosity. Strike 2 came in the form of identity, something I didn't even fully understand at the time. I wasn't interested in the things my father wanted me to be interested in. Football, hunting, church leadership. I couldn't pretend to care. And I sure as hell wasn't going to lie about it. Strike 3? I talked back. If there was ever a moment I stood up for myself, even slightly disagreed, questioned a rule, or pointed out hypocrisy, I was labeled disrespectful, ungrateful, defiant, the problem child. And once that label stuck, it became my entire identity in that house. You want to know what favoritism looks like in a family like mine? Picture my 12th birthday. I asked for a sketch pad and pencils, something quiet, personal. My brother Ben asked for a basketball hoop. Guess which one he got? Guess which one of us had to smile through a shared gift we didn't ask for, under the guise of, it's for everyone. It didn't stop there. Anytime something went wrong, Katie's temper tantrum, Luke's broken vase, even Dad's bad day, I was somehow to blame. You walked in at the wrong time. You distracted your sister. You didn't show enough respect this morning, and now look how the day's gone. It's wild, right? To be the emotional barometer of a house you didn't build. My mom was no better. Her weapon of choice was the cold shoulder, the pursed lips, the exaggerated sighs that said, "You're exhausting." My father preferred lectures, slammed doors, and loud prayers about deliverance from rebellion. Discipline wasn't about teaching, it was about breaking. I remember one night, I was maybe 15, sitting at the dinner table while my father dissected my behavioral flaws in front of everyone like I wasn't even there. My younger siblings sat silently, wide-eyed and frozen, like they didn't know whether to pity me or take notes on how to avoid being next. And the thing that haunted me most? They never were next. It was always me. The double standards were endless. Ben could sneak out, lie about it, and still get dessert. If I stayed in my room too long, I was isolating and needed prayer. Katie once broke a neighbor's window and got comforted for being emotionally fragile. I once rolled my eyes and had to write a 5-page apology essay about dishonoring the family. The worst part? I started believing them, that I was defective, broken, wrong. I even tried harder, memorized verses, volunteered at youth group, tried to talk like them, think like them, be like them. But nothing was ever good enough. My siblings started parroting my parents too. Why can't you just be normal? You always make things harder. Maybe if you listen more, Dad wouldn't be so mad. I lived in a house full of mirrors, but the only reflection I ever saw was the distorted one they painted for me. And when I finally got old enough to name what was happening, to see that this wasn't just strict parenting, but actual manipulation and emotional abuse, I was already halfway out the door emotionally. I started counting down the years until I could leave. Every family gathering was just a reminder of what I wasn't: obedient, accepted, loved. Still, I stayed. Longer than I should have. Part of me hoped they'd change, that one day they'd say, "We were wrong. We love you for who you are." But that moment never came. Sometimes the most liberating decision you'll ever make is the one that doesn't feel brave, it just feels necessary. By the time I turned 23, my tolerance for the chaos of my family had worn down to nothing. The final push, the moment that snapped the last thread, came during a family reunion that summer. It was supposed to be a celebration, one of those big backyard BBQs where people pretend they're a happy family for the sake of photos and potato salad. It was hot, sticky, and loaded with tension even before anything actually happened. I had shown up out of obligation, not affection. Deep down, I already knew this would be the last time. The gathering started like all the others, my father commanding the crowd, my mother fussing over tablecloths and deviled eggs, the golden siblings basking in the glow of parental approval. I kept to myself, mostly hovering near the drink cooler and counting the hours until I could leave. That day, the conversations felt even more pointed than usual. Everyone had something to say about me. Not directly, of course. They'd never confront me like that, but in carefully worded jabs that carried all the same weight. My mother made sure everyone knew I had moved so far away, just like he always wanted to, painting my distance as some kind of selfish act of rebellion. My siblings swapped stories about their adult milestones, jobs, relationships, church events, punctuated by glances in my direction like they were measuring my silence against their success. But the real blow came from my father. He had gathered a small group of extended family to make some kind of speech about family values and how important it was to stay connected. It was standard fare until he started talking about my struggles. He didn't name me, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He spoke about rebellion and selfishness, about how some children lose their way when they abandon their foundation. He said that no matter how far someone strays, a good parent keeps praying, keeps hoping. Then he looked directly at me and said something about how disappointing it is when your own child turns their back on everything you've worked so hard to build. There it was. No anger, no yelling, just this calm, condescending disappointment that hit harder than any punishment ever had. He wasn't trying to discipline me. He was trying to erase me. Everyone went quiet for a moment, unsure whether to nod in agreement or pretend they hadn't heard what was just said. I felt a heat build in my chest, not embarrassment, not even rage, but something colder, something final. I stood there, surrounded by people who'd known me my whole life but never truly seen me, and I felt completely alone. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being by yourself, it comes from being invisible in a room full of people who claim to love you. I didn't say anything. I didn't make a scene or storm off. I just turned and walked away. That night, I packed everything I owned. I didn't leave a note. I didn't text anyone goodbye. I deleted every contact from my phone, wiped my social media, and changed every password. I used the little savings I had to book a one-way flight across the country. The first few weeks were terrifying. I flew into a new city where I didn't know a single person. I stayed in a motel, eating sandwiches and any freelance gigs I could find on the internet. It was the loneliest period of my life. But I kept going. I found a job waiting tables at a small diner downtown. Over time, I moved into a shared apartment with 2 other people who didn't ask too many questions. I found a therapist who didn't flinch when I told her the full story. I started journaling again, running, listening to music I wasn't allowed to play in the house growing up. Little by little, I rebuilt. Not just a life, but a version of myself that wasn't shaped by guilt or shame or someone else's version of morality. It wasn't perfect. There were still bad days. Still nights when I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain I'd made everything up and that maybe I was the problem child. It was 5 years before I heard from anyone in my family again. Only, when I did, it wasn't a call. It wasn't an apology. It was a funeral. For me, it's a strange thing, stumbling across your own obituary. It started like any other night. I was winding down after a long shift, the kind that leaves your feet aching and your brain fuzzy. I had poured myself a glass of wine, planning to decompress with something mindless on TV. But before I even made it to the couch, I found myself scrolling through Facebook. I rarely used it anymore, mostly to keep in touch with people from work or catch the occasional event invite. That night, I was just killing time. Then I saw it. A post shared by an old neighbor from back home, someone I hadn't thought about in years. The profile picture was familiar, a snapshot of a golden retriever I remembered from the neighborhood. What caught my eye was the photo attached to the post, a grainy, sunlit image of a kid in a Little League uniform. Me. The caption read something like, "Rest easy, sweet boy. You were misunderstood, but you had a good heart. Gone too soon." At first, I thought maybe she'd posted about someone else. But the photos kept coming. A carousel of childhood images I hadn't seen in years. Me in a Halloween costume. A class picture from elementary school. One of those awkward church retreat group shots. All of them unmistakably me. My stomach dropped. I didn't feel panic. Not immediately. It was more like this surreal, out-of-body feeling, like I was watching someone else's life being mourned. My first instinct was to check the comments. Dozens of messages. People reminiscing, sharing vague memories, offering condolences. One comment mentioned a memorial service at my old church. Another talked about how strong my parents had been through the loss. Someone even said something about how they'd been moved by the sermon and donated to a mental health awareness fund in my name. I sat there frozen, reading it over and over again. My parents told everyone I died. Not estranged, not missing. Dead. Eventually, I found a post from the church's official page. A tribute video, slideshow style, with sad music and everything. They had called it a celebration of life. There were photos of me as a kid, and a voiceover from the pastor talking about how I'd struggled silently and left this world too soon. I watched it, all 8 minutes of it, in disbelief. Each image felt like a slap to the face. I had been erased and rewritten as a tragic cautionary tale. The worst part? People bought it. Entirely. There were posts from classmates, old church friends, even teachers. Comments about how I was always so quiet, so kind. None of them knew I was alive. Once the numbness wore off, the rage settled in. I started digging deeper. It didn't take long to piece it together. Apparently, the story had been that I died in a car accident after moving away during a hard time. No one questioned it. The details were vague enough to fly under the radar, just specific enough to be believable. But what truly pushed me over the edge was discovering what came after. The Mental Health Fund wasn't a real charity. It was a fundraiser hosted by the church, meant to honor my memory. My parents had been front and center at every event, my father giving speeches about the pain of losing a child, my mother crying quietly in the front pew. They used my supposed death to generate sympathy, donations, pity, and apparently, they used that money to pay off their mortgage and renovate their house. A neighbor mentioned in a comment how the Lord provided for them after such a tragic loss. A new kitchen, fresh siding, even a fancy garden in the front yard. All built on the lie of my absence. The kind of betrayal that hit me wasn't just personal, it was existential. They hadn't just cut me out of their lives. They had rewritten the ending of my story. They painted me as broken, gone, and conveniently out of the way. And the community rallied around them, completely unaware that the person they were mourning was still very much alive, watching from the other side of the screen. It was so absurd. Who does that? What kind of parent chooses an easier story about the death of a child instead of admitting that they pushed him away? It was never about me dying. It was about them avoiding the shame of the truth. They'd finally shown their cards. No more wondering if I had been too sensitive, if maybe I misunderstood their actions, if there was something I could have done differently. They had erased me and turned my absence into a spotlight for themselves. And I knew, right then, that I couldn't let it go. I started by reaching out anonymously to the church. I figured if anyone could give me confirmation of the story they'd been telling, it would be the pastor who stood at the pulpit and cried crocodile tears about the pain of losing a son. It took only one email. I didn't even need to pretend to be someone I wasn't. I just asked, gently, vaguely, if there was a way to get a copy of the memorial service for a relative who couldn't attend but would like to see it. The response was immediate, warm, and full of sympathy. Within hours, a link to a private video landed in my inbox, along with some kind words from the pastor. I watched the entire thing with clenched fists and a straight face. My parents were front and center. My father took the stage, voice heavy with performative grief, and spoke about how I'd always been a troubled soul, but deeply loved. He told the congregation that losing me had taught him the value of family, and that he hoped my story would save someone else from walking a similar path. My mother sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. The kind of performance you'd expect from people who'd lost a child, not from people who had thrown him away. Worse than the lies were the donations. Toward the end of the video, the pastor spoke about the Mental Health Awareness Fund and encouraged everyone to give what they could. There were even graphics showing where the money would go: therapy scholarships, support groups, local counseling programs. None of it existed. I confirmed that with a little digging. No registered nonprofit. No organizational pages. No resources tied to the name of the fund. It was all just a fancy way of saying, we're collecting money off a lie and using grief as currency. That was all I needed to know. The next few days were a blur of screenshots, saved videos, archived posts, and downloaded comment threads. I created a burner email, a cloud folder, and backed up every piece of content. I wanted a digital paper trail so bulletproof that not even my parents' charm could talk their way out of it. Every tribute post, every comment, every dollar raised, it was all saved. And the final nail in the coffin? A text conversation I had saved from my early 20s. One of the last messages I received from my father before I blocked him for good. It was short, cruel, and cutting. He told me that my rebellion had brought shame to the family, and that he hoped I'd one day realize the pain I caused. I never replied, but now it served a new purpose. Context. By the time I finished collecting everything, I had built a comprehensive case, one that showed the timeline of my departure, the lies told afterward, and the profit they'd made from pretending I was dead. I didn't know yet how I was going to use it, but I knew I would. There was a time when I would have wanted justice through legal action, maybe even press charges for fraud. But that wasn't what I wanted now. I didn't want revenge. I wanted exposure. I wanted them to feel what it was like to be stripped bare in front of a crowd, to be seen not as they pretended to be, but for who they truly were. So I started watching, waiting. I stayed anonymous but checked the church's events calendar regularly. And a month later, there it was, an upcoming community fundraiser, hosted in my parents' honor. A night to recognize their strength through loss and their continued dedication to mental health awareness. I booked a flight, found an Airbnb in the next town over, and kept everything quiet. No warnings. No cryptic posts. Just silence. The night of the fundraiser, I arrived early. The church foyer was lined with flowers and blown-up photos of me. Childhood snapshots. A framed quote about hope and resilience. I remember standing there, staring at my own face, thinking, this is what they buried me for. As the fundraiser began, people gathered in the sanctuary. Warm greetings, soft music, the hum of community goodwill. The pastor took the stage first, offering a prayer and thanking everyone for attending. Then, my parents were called up to speak. They walked to the front hand in hand, playing the perfect grieving couple. My mother started by thanking everyone for their support over the years. My father followed, repeating almost word for word the same speech from the memorial video, about how pain can be transformed into purpose. And then I stood up. There was a pause. People turned, trying to place my face, unsure what was happening. I walked calmly down the aisle, not rushing, not making a scene. I approached the podium and looked out at a sea of faces full of confusion. I took a breath. I said, "You're probably wondering how I ended up here if I died a few years ago." Gasps. Real, audible gasps. A few people screamed. One woman dropped her purse. My parents stood frozen behind me, faces pale, mouths open but speechless. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just told the truth. I told the entire room how I had been labeled a lost cause, abandoned by my own family, and how they had chosen to capitalize on my absence rather than reach out. I explained how they told everyone I had died, fabricated a tragedy, and used the community's kindness to bankroll their home renovations. I laid it all out, calmly, factually, like reading from a script. I finished by pointing to the photos of me on the walls. I told the crowd that the boy in those pictures wasn't dead. He was just unwanted, and that there's a difference. If there was a sound that defined that moment, it wasn't my voice. It was the silence that followed. You know the kind I mean, the stunned, heavy silence that swells right before the dam breaks. I hadn't even made it halfway down the church aisle when it started. A single voice from the front row, cracking in disbelief, said my name. Not a question, a realization. And that's when it all unraveled. Voices erupted like a dam burst open. Gasps turned to murmurs, murmurs to yelling. Someone near the front stood up so fast their chair clattered backwards. The church's audio-visual tech scrambled to cut the mic, but it was too late. Everything I said had been broadcast crystal clear through the sound system, echoing off stained glass and wooden pews. A woman I vaguely recognized from childhood Sunday school stood up and demanded to know what was going on. One of the deacons started frantically whispering to the pastor, who looked like he was about to faint. My father tried to speak. He took a hesitant step forward and raised a hand, but it was drowned out by a flood of voices. Angry, confused, stunned. I turned to look at my mother. Her face had lost all color. For the first time in my life, she looked small, like someone who had spent so long building a story around control and manipulation, only to have it pulled from under her in an instant. She didn't say anything. Neither of them did. They just stood there. I walked out the front doors of the church into the cool night air. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of it all. I didn't wait around to see what came next. I didn't need to. I had done what I came to do. And the aftermath? It rippled. In the days that followed, word spread fast. People recorded parts of the event on their phones. Someone uploaded a clip of my speech to Facebook, and it made its way across the community in record time. Within 48 hours, the video had been shared over 100 times. The comments were a mix of outrage, disbelief, and heartbreak. Some people couldn't believe it. Others said it made sense. They'd always wondered why there was so little detail around the accident. A few tried to defend my parents, clinging to the idea that maybe they had misunderstood something. But that defense didn't hold long, because then came the investigation. Turns out, when you collect thousands of dollars in donations under false pretenses, especially through a religious institution, you draw attention. Legal attention. The church, wanting to distance itself from the scandal, initiated an internal audit. My parents were removed from their volunteer roles at the church. The pastor issued a public statement expressing his shock and apology to the congregation. Donations that had not yet been spent were returned. But the money that had already gone into their mortgage, their home upgrades, that couldn't be undone. The church leadership filed a formal complaint with local authorities. I was interviewed by an investigator, not as a complainant, but as a witness. They asked if I wanted to press charges, and I told them no. I wasn't looking for jail time or a lawsuit. I just wanted the truth to stand taller than the lies. My siblings, predictably, scrambled. Ben messaged me first, begging to talk, to explain. He claimed he didn't know the full story, that he'd been told I had disappeared, and that our parents had assumed I was gone for good. But even if that were true, he never reached out. Not once. Katie sent a long email trying to paint herself as another victim, saying she didn't agree with everything our parents did, but didn't feel like she could speak out. Luke stayed silent, which honestly, I respected more than the sudden rush of faux guilt the others threw my way. The fallout didn't stop at just church or social circles. My parents' reputation took a public nosedive. Longtime family friends cut ties. People stopped waving from porches. My mother stopped showing up to church altogether. My father resigned from a board he'd been part of for years. Their social media accounts went dark. They had built their lives on the image of a tight-knit, God-fearing family, and I had shattered it with one sentence. The irony? They could have just said they didn't know where I was, that we'd grown apart, that I was distant. But they didn't want the messiness of estrangement. They wanted the sympathy of tragedy. They buried me in lies so they could rise in praise. And now, they were the ones being looked at with pity. As for me, I didn't go back to hiding. Not this time. For the first time, people in that town knew who I really was, and more importantly, what I'd survived. I started getting messages from others who had experienced similar things: estrangement, emotional abuse, religious trauma. They'd seen the video or read the posts and wanted to share their stories too. So I leaned into that. I wrote about it. I spoke at small events. Nothing huge, just local community centers, mental health panels. But it felt like reclaiming something. My voice. My story. The identity they tried to erase. Then came the fallout beyond social shame. While I chose not to press charges, I didn't want to tie my life to theirs with court dates and drawn-out legal battles. Others didn't look the other way. The church's financial committee launched a formal complaint with local authorities. Turns out, when you use a false death to raise thousands of dollars under the guise of a charitable cause, that crosses more than just moral lines. The local DA's office opened a preliminary fraud investigation. Detectives reached out to people who donated. They pulled financial records from the fake fund and tracked where the money had gone: home renovations, credit card debt, even a luxury vacation that my parents had supposedly taken as part of a healing process. There were murmurs that charges might be filed. Nothing was certain yet, but an official inquiry had begun. And this time, it wasn't something they could lie or cry their way out of. My parents might not face jail time, but their lies now had a paper trail, and they were being held accountable in a way I never thought possible growing up. One day, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father. He didn't apologize. Not really. It was 3 pages of justification. How he and my mother had only done what they thought was best. That they had grieved, in their own way. That I had hurt them too. I didn't finish reading it. I folded it up and put it in a drawer, not to hold on to, but to remind myself that I didn't need their closure to find my own. Because I already had it. It didn't come wrapped in forgiveness or a dramatic reunion. It came in the silence that followed my truth. In the emails from strangers. In the mirror, when I could finally look at myself and see someone whole. I had walked out of that church as a ghost made real again. Not the child they discarded. Not the lie they spun. But me. Alive. Free. Unapologetic. And this time, I wasn't going anywhere.